So hi, everyone. My name is Rob Solomon. I work at Consensys. My focus is on building the tools, processes, infrastructure that help to construct and enable, support decentralized organizations. I have a kind of specific focus on inserting market principles into firms. So this journey started for me 6 years ago. I was leading a finance team at a company that implemented Holacracy, which is a well-known but kind of problematic framework for decentralizing organizations, but saw a lot of opportunity in that concept. Have been kind of following and contributing to the space since. So a little bit about Consensys really quick. This talk isn't about Consensys, but it gives you context for why we're doing what we're doing. So we are a collection of 50 different internal applications, building wallets, supply chain applications, healthcare applications, fintech tools, so on. We have offices all over the world, New York, San Francisco, Dublin, London, Paris, Philippines, Australia, and other places. And we have a bunch of internal teams supporting those other startups and solutions offices, being marketing, design, finance, legal, so on. And we're kind of a remote-first company. We have people all over the world. This is a map of our organization from like a week ago. So you have people in all these different places. And actually, too, when you look at this isn't 290 people in New York. There are a lot of people working from their homes in Jersey, Connecticut, Toronto, and so on. So we really are quite distributed that way. And the reason I bring all of that up is not to talk about Consensys, but to say that Consensys is trying to be a massive organization in terms of the amount of people it employs, the industries it plays in, the levels of maturity, the different projects that it has. And if we can't afford at Consensys to be a centralized, monolithic organization that moves at the speed of massive corporations that you see in the market today, we need to be able to react and innovate in the Web3 space, which is moving incredibly quickly, and we need to play in a bunch of different industries, each of which have their own complications. So we want to find a way to kind of preserve our startupiness. And I have a theory as to why corporations lose their startupiness. It comes down to the diminishing effectiveness of centralized hierarchical coordination as a means for organizing firms. So you start with a small, less complex organization. Centralized hierarchical coordination works great. It's as you start to get more complex that the effectiveness goes down. And that's because communication lines in a hierarchy are low bandwidth and low fidelity. Every time information has to pass between departments and people, a ton of context and information is lost. We're humans. We only have so much bandwidth and brain power to process everything that we need to. And also, as an organization gets larger and more obscure, the gap between what's best for the individual and what's best for the company starts to grow a little bit more, and it becomes easier to play politics and to not take any risks than it is to do what actually creates the most value for the organization. So that's when I want to introduce the concept of decentralized market-based coordination as the alternative. And let's use the example of an economic system. So, and economic systems are great for this because they exist at every scale, from tiny to massive. And really, if you think about a large economy, it's just a massive corporation with a ton of different divisions, and it's very decentralized, right? So in the first example, you have a small village. So imagine a 20-person village, and there's a chief, and he says, all right, you 20 build shelter, or you 10 build shelter, you 5 get clothes, you 5 get food. I'll make sure everybody shares and everyone's pulling their weight. That would work just fine. In fact, it actually works better than any type of capitalist market-based system. If you could imagine a 20-person village trying to establish a free-floating currency, court systems, contract law, it's not worth the overhead, and just making quick decisions would be better. And you wouldn't want to have to wait for the market to correct itself when the farmer decides he wants to be a painter and no one's doing any making food for a while. On the flip side, you have a 100 million person complex economy. Clearly it doesn't matter how smart that chief is, doesn't matter how many people he delegates to. You could never run that as a centrally planned economy. Even centrally planned economies that we've seen in the past in the world still rely on currencies, contract laws, and things like that. So they're not completely centrally planned. They're centrally guided. But and yet we know even those are not effective compared to decentralized market-based organizations. So let's bring it now to corporations. 20-person startup, the founder has a pretty good idea of what everyone's doing, can direct things, can know who's not pulling their weight. People, when they add value to the organization, it's fairly clear there's less room for politics. The issue comes as companies start to get more and more complex and unknowingly start to move past this intersection point, or knowingly start to move past this intersection point on the graph. And most companies kind of end up down here. Many large companies do things to decentralize, and you think about what a conglomerate is. It's a bunch of separate companies that have some shared back office, but they're meaningfully distinct. And even in larger corporations, different departments have their own targets. They do accounting and budgeting at the department level. They incentivize department leads based on their department's performance, and they give them some autonomy. And they do cost transferring and accounting. All these things decentralize the firm a little bit. But we've not yet landed on the right way to truly decentralize organizations to make them effective. And my argument is that evidence of this is that there's no reason why a massive corporation with 15 years head start on R&D, talent acquisition, with a ton of resources, distribution channels should get outcompeted by a startup. Yet it happens all the time. And my hypothesis is that it's because they're not operating as effectively as they could with all the people that they have, given their org structure. So we want to be decentralized. We don't just want to delegate a lot of authority. We want to legitimately decentralize how we decide what we do, where we do it, who does it, how we incentivize the people who do it. And we're doing things at Consensys from common and subtle to new and radical. And some of this is very aspirational. So some of these things that we are doing and practicing, some things are very early stages, some things we hope to get to. First being transparency. So we try to default to transparency whenever possible. We have monthly town halls where people ask very, very direct questions to our founder, and he's very truthful in answering them, which is a bit unusual compared to some organizations, not all. We also have bi-weekly updates where teams give status updates on what they're producing and how you can help them and plug into them, so there's just general awareness. And more recently, we've started publicly broadcasting our, publicly internally, not public to the rest of the world, our internal budget process. So when a team needs a budget, they'll pitch their plan, they'll pitch their operating plan, their financial plan, how they make decisions, what their values are, all of that, and the entire company can kind of weigh in and provide feedback on that. Idea here being to decrease siloing, to decrease redundancy, and help people collaborate better across the organization. The next is purpose-driven teams. So, and what I mean by this is organizing teams based on what they exist to do, not based on the expertise of the people in them or the region that they operate in. And so we'll talk about this in the context of Acme Widgets. So imagine Acme Widgets is a company that sources raw materials, manufactures widgets in China, and then moves them to a warehouse in Indianapolis, and then sells them retail and wholesale. This would be probably a typical organizational structure for them, where you have the CEO, you have a chief revenue officer who's overseeing retail and wholesale sales, you have a COO over logistics, warehousing, facilities, and inventory planning, and you have other kind of support executives playing a role there. This is a revisualization of that organization using one of our tools that we've built. This is how we organize Consensys, using this tool called Sobel, which is, I think they are in beta. And what I'm showing is the same organization, but organized based around purpose-driven teams. So for the example of this, I'm going to use the assistant general counsel, who would typically just be in the legal team, and that's where you would see them on an org chart. Now you see Andrea Atuna, the assistant general counsel, and she actually holds a bunch of different roles. So she has a role in the legal circle and in the risk circle, which is standard. But you can also see that her role as mentor is defined here. Her role as lease and landlord point person is here in this facility circle. And she has a contracts negotiator role in the inventory circle. And if you were to zoom in on that circle specifically, materials procurement, you'd see on their profile page that they exist to source high quality and cost-effective raw materials that produce perfect finished products. Their team drive, frequently asked questions, and some of the reporting is available there. You can see their team members. They've tagged their areas of focus, so it's searchable. And if you click over to their roles, you can see they have these people who are full-time doing materials procurement, But they also have a data analyst from the data analytics team who's giving 30% of his time to this team. You have Andrea in her contracts negotiator role, giving 25% of her time to this team. And you see the COO, Tom, in a quality standards role, giving 5% of his time to this team, so that it's clear who's contributing to what. It's very clear what this team exists to do, and it decreases the chances of redundancy or siloing, organizing this way. Next is an agreements fabric. So this, we're talking about how different teams make agreements between each other to become more explicit in how they work together. And I'll give examples of all these from the context of a generic data analytics team. So in this context, let's see, the first one is team operating agreements. We try to have teams form team operating agreements. We're early in this, but we want teams to define how they make decisions, how they onboard and offboard, what their values are, and how they generally work as a team. If you have a traditional team where there's a clear lead, you probably don't need this as much, but we have a lot of teams that are non-traditional, trying to be more flat in the way that they organize, and you realize quickly that teams think they're aligned on how they make decisions and how they onboard and offer people until they're not, and then they realize that they don't have a process or a system for making decision makings. They get jammed up. It leads to personal conflict and is overall destructive to the efficiency of that team. So team operating agreements are a great, easy kind of first step. The next is the mandate agreement, and this is kind of replacing budgeting for us. So this would be an agreement between a team and finance or the CEO or whatever group is kind of administering the resources internally. And so I mentioned we're broadcasting this process for the entire company to see. At the end of it, we'll form one of these agreements where we define the resource constraints, the burn constraints, operating commitments, such as they have to show up to certain meetings, they have to maintain a certain NPS or Net Promoter Score when they're interacting with their customers, they have to do X, Y, and Z. They also maybe have to be good cultural citizens of the company, and there's different criteria for that. So we would define all of that in an agreement, and that way the team is clear on what their mandate is, what their resources are, and they can pivot and remain dynamic and nimble versus playing to a fixed budget and be more autonomous with that mandate agreement. The next is service agreements. These are a little bit more intuitive. So let's say the data analytics team, maybe it's building dashboards for other internal teams. We would define that the deliverables, the timelines, the expectations, quality standards, acceptance criteria, all of that would be defined in a service agreement. And maybe they would also have service agreements with the facilities team about the space that they get to work in, or the IT team in terms of the support that they receive and how they ask for new applications and things like that. And then lastly is external agreements. There's nothing new here. We're not reinventing anything. Teams form external agreements all the time. So data analytics might have agreements with Tableau, MongoDB, and AWS, and might have external customers as well. So those would be the 4 different types of agreements that we have. And again, the purpose here with all of these is to be explicit about the relationship between teams and other teams. Next is people points. This is an interesting concept that I've worked with in the past that we're not doing at Consensys. We're talking about leapfrogging right over it, but I did work in it. This is kind of what introduced me to market dynamics when I was working in the holacratic organization. Was this idea that you would give a team a people points budget, where 1 people point equals 1% of a FTE's time, a full-time equivalence time. And so this way you could give the data analytics team a 2.9 FTE budget, but they don't have to spend it on 2.9 people. They can have 5 people, and in this case you see that 80 are given to Miguel and Alice, 90 given to Kathy, and then they have these 2, Jerry and Alice, also filling 40 people point collective roles there. So you can distribute your people budget among multiple people, and what it also does, which is great, is it allows people like Jerry, for example, to contribute to multiple different teams, multiple different leads, multiple different purposes, yet still be accountable to being fully allocated. That was the problem that originally we had with Holacracy, and where this came from was we had people where they'd be in one circle, they'd be 5% allocated, and the lead there would just assume that they're 95% allocated somewhere else, but they weren't. They were 5% allocated this place and this place and this place, and they were only spending 15% of their time actually doing work, and there was no accountability for it. So this was an answer to that. But a step past that is full-on market dynamics. This is the thing that I'm most passionate about, and something that we're still very, very early and even exploring for Consensys. But this is the idea of transforming a corporation into something that's more like a digital city, where the teams inside of it are more like the companies. So here again, back to Acme. Different Acme in this case. maybe it looks more like Amazon. They build their own phones, they do films, they have an e-store, all that. It's about transforming it from a traditional organization where you see a thick line around the outside and clear silos, clear divisions, to something that is more of a permeable ecosystem where the purpose-driven teams inside of the organization are more like micro companies, and they transact with each other, they transact outside the firm. We're giving over the reins to these teams so we believe we can achieve better feedback loops, better incentives, more resiliency. And you're embracing some redundancy, some waste this way, some lack of control, but the hypothesis is that the scalability from decentralization will allow you to grow into a more and more complex and resilient organization. Yeah, so how am I doing on time, Kate, do you know? A couple more minutes, or? Okay. Well, I'll go quickly through a hypothetical product demo that gives a better idea of what working in such a system might look like. So again, data analytics team. This is from the context of data analytics team. We build custom dashboards for various teams. You click on my team page. You can see, okay, here we are. Here's what we do. Here's what we offer. Here's the team. Here's the certifications we have. Here's reviews that we've received from past clients, both internal and external. So as a data analytics team, we want to have a video made that shows our users how to onboard into our system. So we go here, go to the marketplace, go to marketing and creative, click on video and animation. And we'd see two internal vendors here that can make videos for us. We'd see a couple external vendors noted by the red stars that they're external that are preferred vendors for providing video services. And let's say we pick Happy Video because they have great reviews and they're in-network and there's some incentives for working with in-network teams. We can see, again, their reviews, their certifications, who's on their team, the prices for creating a video, all of that. Looks great, so we're going to engage them. Go back, click on the contracts application. Now we're working on building a contract with them. We can base it off of one of our templates, so you can create templates here. And then create quick contracts with those teams. Again, part of the reason for doing this is so you don't have to have a 40-page contract between external parties as another internal party to this ecosystem. You can just do like a quick one-pager that would be good enough to quickly resolve any conflict if you needed some arbitrator to step in on it internally. And then you form the contract. You go to pay them. You have your banking application. You can see all your recent transactions. So I can see that we just paid them here. You can see the $5,480 going out. You can see your balances here. If you wanted to send money, you just click Who To and add an invoice or whatever you need and submit for approval. Or you can request funds, which is invoicing other teams inside the organization for work that you've done. And then all this would be automatically imported into your accounting application. So you see the transactions here. You would need somebody to come in and code those for you. It would probably still be the finance team that would do it unless you wanted to do that within your own team. And then from that, you can come back and see your income statement showing your actuals versus your budget. You could click on the type and pick a different type. So maybe you want to see external versus external transactions and things like that. And so that would be basic walkthrough of what the application might look like. The relevance with blockchain in all of this is certainly not expressly said here, but the idea of the medium of exchange token that would be used between teams would be a blockchain token that you may be able to, maybe there's an internal medium of exchange token that when you go to pay an external vendor, it passes through a smart contract and maybe a fee is taken or something like that. There's also the idea of each team having their equity in some type of security token. You could have utility tokens across the network that grant you access to certain types of applications, other ways of performing governance. So all of that is highly contemplated for this, and it's something that's a priority at Consensys, at least as we move towards this, to come up with a cohesive tokenized model for how we want to operate. So yeah, so with all this, we want to become more like a digital city. And so what do I mean by becoming a digital city? Well, it means something to be part of a city. Like there's laws, there's taxes, there's benefits to being co-located with other things. And the city will grow and prosper as the businesses that make up that city also grow and prosper. But the city doesn't actively manage and direct those businesses, doesn't own them, except for its kind of preferred equity that it takes its dividends through taxes. Similarly, companies of the future, they'll become a collection of autonomous teams in the way that a city is a collection of autonomous businesses The autonomous teams inside of a company will transact with one another. They'll transact outside the network, and it's the job of the city to create a fertile ground, provide the right resources, provide the right ecosystem for these teams to thrive. And this way, any company could become arbitrarily large, build an arbitrary amount of products, attack an arbitrary amount of industries because they don't have the scalability issues of having to manage the organization as a centralized organization. They don't have centralized resource allocation. Resources are coming from all over the place. So there's less risk and there's more scalability. And the idea is that we hopefully see more resilient and innovative organizations as a result. So we want to build that application that I showed you. We want to find ways to tokenize Consensys and build kind of this cohesive future of work product suite. So if that's of interest to you, come find me. We'll talk more about it. And with any time left, yeah, let's do questions for 5 minutes. Cool. Yeah, we'll do questions. That's all I say.
Have any questions?
So Cone is an in-house product that you guys built just for your company, basically?
The product that I was showing there at the end? Yeah, so that is, those are just wireframes that I personally made. It's something that we do want to build. Fortunately, being internal, we're able to test a lot of those concepts without having to build anything. We can test teams transacting with one another using agreements and things like that without having to actually build that application. But given our aspiration for tokenization and how we want to see things progress quickly, building that will become a priority. So right now there's no code, it's just a wireframe, but hopefully very soon become an application.
And about all the agreements that you showed, like the 4 agreements, is this available? Is that public, or is that also just internal for now?
Well, the concept is certainly something that I could put in an email and share. The actual agreements themselves, the internal team operating agreements, mandate agreements and service agreements that are between teams inside of Consensys, we haven't made public yet. And again, this is something that's kind of early for us. We have certain teams that are very prolific with creating service agreements, some teams that haven't really gotten into that yet, and we're trying to make that more widespread throughout the organization, but we're not there yet. We haven't published any, but there's no reason why we couldn't. So it's something that we just have to talk about and try to make sure that we're comfortable and pick a couple that we think are good case studies and present them. Just hasn't been a priority yet, but easily could be.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, one more?
So is Consensys now just going to use this, let's say, modern back office tool with tokens and stuff, but still remain a standard corporation, or is it actually going to be turned into actual DAO with user governance and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a super complicated question. We have a lot of thinking to do just on our own, because typically, the decisions that we make about our strategy aren't typically made by just one person. It's usually a group of people coming together and really fleshing out the opportunity in various cases. And there certainly are compromises to being the first to try something like that in terms of how do the public markets respond to that? How does that work from a legal and compliance standpoint? I think the biggest thing is going to be part of the biggest thing is going to be on compliance, legally, and how these tokens are treated, and what people are allowed to do with them, and what the responsibilities of the board are if we have a board, and things like that. But I can speak for myself in saying that turning Consensys into a DAO would be very cool to me, and something that I'll kind of push towards. But I have to be realistic about the limitations given the landscape where it is currently.
I have 2 questions. First of all, where do you think is the cutoff point between the small village model and the big model? So, is it the Dunbar number, 150 people, where it kind of turns?
And maybe there is some type of research you could do to actually be more scientific about this, but I think it's more of a factor of complexity versus just size. So I could imagine a 1,000-person organization that's all call center employees being quite effective and quite simple to manage, centrally, to just staff them and set the operating procedures and things like that. And I could imagine a 30-person team being, attacking a bunch of different things, being too complex to manage from one central point. So I think it really depends on what the team is doing and how they operate as to whether they should be going for more of the city model versus being a micro company. The nice thing though about this kind of approach is you don't necessarily have to set that. In the same way that with capitalism, we don't set the maximum size for a firm. We just kind of let it naturally emerge. So if there's a group that's getting too big, they might start to feel some pressure to fracture a bit, or they might be outcompeted by a group that does it better than them, that is more nimble. So we'll hopefully see that being naturally kind of emergent and sorted out.
And one more question. What about just using kind of the standard market contracts and just kind of standardize the interfaces? So this way, what you could do is you could kind of make the edges of the company kind of fuzzier, because you could just access the whole market for the teams. So not kind of standardizing on a software stack and infrastructure, and let's say, okay, the dashboard team will use this standard contract if preferred, and otherwise they could negotiate it, and kind of because we have markets for a very long time, and
and partly the demo is built specifically to sell or to show people who are used to a more traditional legacy context. So to show them a page where they could pick any external vendor that's not vetted, typically scares a lot of folks, but that's certainly very very possible. The only thing I'm hoping to accomplish with the tool is to just decrease the transaction costs between teams inside the firm, to make it easier to search, to make it easier to form agreements. So the whole purpose of the templates is they can generate their own templates, they can use other people's templates, it doesn't matter. Whatever is easiest for them to be able to do that. And the benefit to being a part of this network is versus transacting externally is maybe there's shared performance incentives, maybe you own a bit of every team, maybe there are, based on how much of this medium exchange token you exchange, benefits to that, other reputational benefits, maybe it's cheaper just like on a per transaction basis to transact. Maybe it's easier to settle disputes in terms of the contracts. So that's the idea, is to build a tool to support that type of interactions internally, but to make it completely open to markets as much as possible. The one thing that we'd have to balance is if each micro company is its own entity, then it's easier to let them kind of run free. If they are all part of one corporation, you have to deal with the collective risk of the organization. So if one team is running out, working with bad vendors, doing bad things with bad agreements, it puts the entire company at risk. So that's part of the reason why I don't show the whole thing on that. But if you were to structure it as a collection of entities, then that wouldn't be as much of a problem. You could be more open. Awesome. Okay. I'll answer it afterwards.
Okay, thank you. So according to what you showed, the smallest unit in the network is a team. So I'm wondering what do you use, or how do you look onto the way how to, because it's easy to evaluate a reputation of a team. How do you evaluate the reputation of a particular team members? Is it important in the model? And how do you measure engagement? How do you measure reputation? Like, do you leave it completely on a team? Is there anyone above the team structure, team units having veto right? That's what I'm wondering about.
It's a really interesting question, and definitely something that could be considered for future state of the application. One thing I want to point out too with it is my idea with this was to always build. It's like kind of like iOS. We have just a couple core applications that you can use, like that marketplace application, the banking application, but to allow anybody to build applications on top of it that even compete with a different version of the marketplace application, different version of the banking application that use different atomic units or have reputation at different levels, different ways of visualizing the organization. So what I showed here is a basics kind of starting point where you could certainly, us as a team or any external organization could build on top of it to provide more useful features like that. And that's, contemplating the individual unit and the macro unit, I think is, definitely worthwhile and something that should be, considered in the future. Cool. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.